chariot that takes me down the way. But we were made of fire. It was deep and cold. Dozens of my skeletons walking through the lands of the dead, echoing in spring. Land of the dead, dark times run on shaky. Echoing underground in your panting mad brother. Every hot dog is all life can be. Adventure, children in the lap of my knee. Dragonflies jacuzzi, I don't want to be. Pretending to live in my favorite place. And born and free. Land of the dead, I'm just a little kid. I'm floating in underground. Can't take that away from me.
Can't take that from me. Greetings, folks. Welcome to Offstage Soliloquy, where if you like our sideboards, then you'll love this. Welcome to our October-themed month, where we'll give a month-long celebration to one of our favorite holidays. With me is my intellectual superior and good friend, the Authenticator, a.k.a. Dalton L. Mortimer.
Good evening, folks. As you heard, I absolutely adore our Three of Altair songs, and Land of the Dead is one of my favorites. I apologize for inadvertently serenading you all, but honestly, I can't help but sing along when his songs come up.
And I'm your host / zombie lover, the Brainstormer of Pop Culture. How's everyone doing tonight? Well, first off, this is kind of a special video, well, stream, where we are doing not only Offstage Soliloquy, but also our podcast one-shot for the week, because I have started a job, and I'm going to be busy for the next 2 days working at that job, and I won't be able to do this. But Sundays are fine. We will be doing our regular podcasting there. So yeah, that's basically why we're doing this, and I think we will be doing this for the time being until we actually figure something else out early on in the week or something. Do we have anything else to add, Don, or shall we continue? Shall we move on?
No, I think the anticipation is giving me goosebumps, so we should continue.
I see what you did there. So
it was inevitable.
Yeah. So our first topic will be about Goosebumps. And Don, would you be so kindly to kind of give to kind of inform the uninformed masses of what Goosebumps is?
Well, I'm sure, especially among like late 80s, early 90s kids, don't really need to offer much introduction, but for those that have been living under a rock for the last 20 or 30 years, Goosebumps is essentially a series of childhood dark fantasy and horror novels that sort of borrowed their aesthetic from old folk tales and ghost stories and the like. Also, I know for a fact that one of R.L. Stein's biggest influences when it came to the making of Goosebumps was B-rated horror movies from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. a la like the Killer Blob and the like. In fact, probably his most famous or his most sort of self-referential of the Goosebumps actually featured a story about a 50s style blob creature that consumed everything. It was called The Blob That Ate Everything, and it was probably one of my favorites.
Yeah, and that was more for our very young audience that were born after Goosebumps. Unfortunately, well, actually, no, it didn't even fade into obscurity. It just wasn't as well popular as it was.
Although to be fair, anyone who's not familiar with Goosebumps, the very well received and very well adapted Goosebumps television show is currently streaming on Netflix. So you have scant excuse for watching the old series, especially now during Halloween when it is probably the most Goosebumps affiliated time of the year.
Also, check out R.L. Stein's other works, as like his books and other TV shows that it came from.
Yes. Personally, I actually enjoy the Haunting Hour series that came out a couple years ago slightly more than I do Goosebumps, and that's saying something considering I kind of grew up on Goosebumps.
I think both are well. I can see uh, obvious differences, um, but I think both are good. I would say also don't check. I honestly cannot recommend the Goosebumps movie.
I can if you're willing to put up with a lot of like self-referential humor. I don't think it's the best portrayal of the Goosebumps, but I think in a world where everyone either grew up on the TV show or the movie, there's no harm in the like self-referential comedy that was the Jack Black movie. The sequel, on the other hand, is scheisse, and do not watch it because it is shit. But the first one is at least tolerable in like a cheesy Halloween classic kind of way.
Right. There was also what was that one movie? It had Emily Osment in it.
The Haunting Hour.
Yeah,
No relation to the actual Haunting Hour series of books or
yeah.
the show that it inspired.
hmm Um. So it was. Yeah. Basically, there is nothing I can add to Dawn's like description of it. So I guess kind of moving on. What would be your favorite Goosebumps story, Dawn?
Um, that's a hard one. It's very hard to pick a favorite of Goosebumps because I I don't think there's honestly a bad Goosebumps story or episode of the show. Um, I will say probably the most personally nostalgic for me is the Monster Blood series because it is both one of the first episodes of the show I ever watched and also the first book in the book series I ever read. So the Monster Blood book and its many sequels, of which there were quite a few, are probably my favorite standing series um within Goosebumps. Another shout out goes to one of the few standalone Goosebumps books, which is called uh, "Be Careful What You Wish For," which is basically a twist on the creepy shopkeeper who grants people's wishes, but with a twist archetype. The Goosebump episode that it inspired, not quite as good, but the book itself is actually really good.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Well, last week when we did some coverage of this. Oh no, last week on the podcast, we I had gone a little bit into it about my a couple of my favorites. Basically, two primary Goosebumps stories, both as books and as episodes, kind of have helped me get into both comic books and filmmaking, which is Attack of the Mass Mutant and A Shocker on Shock Street. Uh, so, Attack of the no, it's not Attack of the Mass Mutant. It's Attack of the Mutant, where essentially a comic book villain comes to life and starts tormenting a reader, like a fan of the comics.
And he ends up having to use his knowledge of the comics to essentially get out of things.
I wish there had been a sequel to that book because it did kind of leave it on a kind of cliffhanger where essentially the main character of the book became a superhero by a comic book that was sent to him,
Mm-hmm.
which was really cool in my opinion.
Yeah, that's definitely a good one. I've seen the episode a lot of times, but I've never actually read the book that went along with it.
I
So
saw the episode first, and then years down the line, I read the book. Both are really enjoyable, in my opinion. Um, Also, in the episode of Attack of the Mutant, Adam West played the superhero Gazelle guy.
you're right. I never noticed that, and now I'm noticing it, and it gets even more geek cred because, of course, Adam West was the first live action Batman in the modern era with the famous 60s TV show.
Yeah, yeah, that's really cool. Um, so yeah, that was actually something that had started to get me very interested in comic books. Just something that kind of the uniqueness and like the colors and the dynamic, that just the dynamic style of comics themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And a shock.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm? Um,
No, go ahead.
yeah, okay. And A Shocker on Shock Street, which was essentially this. It centered around the idea of two kids that were being brought in to kind of test a amusement park that was based on a series of movies. A Shocker on Shock Street series of movies, where like these like kind of campy B horror movies
Mm-hmm.
that are praised for like their amazing prosthetics and effects and stuff, like practical effects and costumes.
In other words, the R.L. Stein version of Hammer horror.
Yeah, and well, the twist, as there always is a twist, is that they
Yeah,
used
much in the same vein as like a Twilight Zone, which I can't help but imagine that was also a large influence on R.L. Stein.
yeah. I mean, even a lot of the episodes would open with R.L. Stein. Um, you know,
Providing a Rod Serling-esque intro to things, yes.
mhm,
And particularly episodes like Say Cheese and Die are direct riffs on Twilight Zone episodes. Specifically in the case of Say Cheese and Die, obviously it's a riff on the episode A Most Unusual Camera.
yeah. So again, my favorite. So the reason why I like it is because it turns out that a lot of the quote unquote like suit actors that were dressed up in the stuff were robots, very advanced robots, and the kids were also robots, but they didn't know it. It's been a while since I've read the book and seen the episode, so I'm not sure how much of it is page for page, like note for note in story.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's very familiar. I think the episode had a kind of different ending compared to the book.
Yeah. Although to be fair, there are times when the series made the books better. For example, in the books of Monster Blood, the origin of the actual Monster Blood itself was really kind of a supernatural like curiosity or a trinket. But in the episode based on Monster Blood, it's revealed that the monster blood in question is actually as in the blood of monsters and was actually a spell ingredient from a sorceress that the main character's aunt used to have as a tenant. So yeah, I really enjoy when the supernatural quotient on things is up for obvious reasons. So I actually enjoy the show's backstory for Monster Blood better than the book's backstory for Monster Blood.
That's so Goosebumps.
It is.
I
Which
think
of
I'm gonna,
course made me think of That's So Raven, which is another vaguely supernaturally oriented show we could talk about at some point in the near future, but that's an issue for another day.
yeah. So, yeah. So, and again, I said this before. I think without those two episodes and books, you know, Attack of the Mutant and Shocker on Shock Street, I probably wouldn't be as big of a kind of geek in both the comic sense and like I wouldn't be appreciative of the comics and filmmaking as I am now, or maybe, but it'd be different.
Yeah, honestly, I don't. Since something as small as that was enough to get you into it, I honestly think that it was probably kind of inevitable that you get into it eventually, but I am I am still glad that you got into it that way because it's entirely possible, even if you got into comics in some other way, we might not have met in the circumstances that we did. So,
Yeah. So yeah, that's
in short, thank you, R.L. Stein, for inadvertently delivering one of my best friends to me.
yeah, making me blush.
Well, I mean, it's I'm just speaking the truth here. At this point, I talk to you more than I talk to basically any of my other friends. So yeah,
Right. I got deep.
it always does.
Yeah. So moving on to our next question: why has Goosebumps endured for so long? Like, what are your theories on why?
I think because it does touch on so many of the heartstrings of so many different sort of geeky subcultures, like the fact that it's that most of it is loosely based on some kind of modern folklore that resonates, I think, well with people. You can see that even in things like modern day creepypasta. There's a part of the human psyche that enjoys sort of the lore of the unknown and the forbidden and the supernatural. And of course, the B movie 30s through 50s aesthetic of Goosebumps helps as well. The 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 notion I've always had with Goosebumps is it's a series by supernatural horror nerds for supernatural horror nerds. Whether your reference point for supernatural horror is folklore and ghost stories, or whether it's 50s schlock horror, or whether it's something like, comic books and like Tales from the Crypt or something. Goosebumps sort of takes bits and pieces of all of these things, puts them together in a nice, neat little bow, and feeds them back to you. And I think I think it speaks to the fact that R.L. Stein just is a geek for these things in exactly the same way as his readership would be. And there's a lot to be said for people who love these things getting into these things just because their love will inevitably show through. And I think that's sort of the secret sauce of R.L. Stein's success I think he's a supernatural horror nerd who just unabashedly decided to devote his entire life to all the weird shit he was into, and so much the better for him.
Yeah. Also, I just looked this up because I was curious.
Mm-hmm.
There are 235 books.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
How many episodes of the series are there? Just out of curiosity.
74.
So, in other words, there's enough Goosebumps books that they could make a second series if they wanted to. Now, granted, I don't think it would be quite as successful this time around because there was something special about the atmosphere of the early to mid 90s that made Goosebumps work or worked with the source material of Goosebumps in a way I don't think the modern world quite would.
I guess that kind of moves into our into our last question for Goosebumps. Should it,
Segway.
yeah, should it or could it be revived? Why or why not?
I think it could. I'm just not so sure I'm willing to say that it should be. Because like I said, there's something about the atmosphere of the early to mid 90s that worked for Goosebumps. And I don't think we're currently living in the same zeitgeist as we were when you and I were kids. The
Right. It could also be that it's safe to say that people are kind of more efficient in knowledge of horror today, like general audience, kind of.
and that's probably a good thing. But the this another sort of secret weapon of Goosebumps, at least in my opinion, is I never found a single one of them scary. I always viewed Goosebumps in the same way I viewed the Addams Family, which is they're spooky in the way that lets the reader in on the joke, but you're not actually supposed to be afraid. At most, you're supposed to be creeped out, but creeped out in the kind of titillating, ooh, this is exciting way, not in the this is horrifying way.
Plus, to be honest, it probably wouldn't be made today, or if it would, it'd be the crap we kind of
I
expect.
my my main worry is I feel like in the modern era they would be extremely heavy-handed with the social and socio-cultural and political commentary in the same way that the modern version of Twilight Zone that came out this past year kind of dipped too much into the socio-cultural Kool-Aid and basically just became a slightly different version of Black Mirror. And that's great and all, but Black Mirror is not the new Twilight Zone. And I feel like if someone was to make a modern version of Goosebumps, they would fill it with socio-political overtones that the original just didn't have.
You know what? You know what's weird? They kind of made a modern day Goosebumps with the Haunting Hour.
Well, they did because essentially R.L. Stine wanted to make some books and a show that was more targeted towards um teens and young adults as opposed to uh at adolescents and preteens, which was the main audience for Goosebumps back in the day.
Right.
And I think he was smart enough to know he didn't have to be edgy to get away with making a series for adults. In fact, a lot of it's funny to me, and I think this confirms the thing I said earlier about how Goosebumps was never meant to be entirely scary. It was always meant to be kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge in on the joke. Um, the Haunting Hour series was a lot less scary than, or a lot less focused on being scary than Goosebumps was. What it did instead was it took its subject matter significantly more seriously than Goosebumps did. And I think that worked because there was always a ambiguity to the supernatural in Goosebumps, i.e., the supernatural could be dark and scary and something to be avoided, but it could also be something positive and something to be utilized when necessary. In Haunting Hour, though, it was always a lot more sympathetic to those that used the supernatural. Like one of my favorite episodes of The Haunting Hour, by far and away, is the episode entitled "My Sister the Witch," where we actually follow a young witch in training as she sort of begins her first steps along the path. And I don't think that's something you could have gotten away with in Goosebumps, even though Goosebumps was always, like I said, kind of ambiguous, because they were fairly clear in that episode, in the Haunting Hour episode, that her studying magic did not make her a bad person, or what it wasn't even necessarily a thing to be discouraged. If anything, all the bad shit that happens in that episode happened as a result of her younger brother's irrational fear of magic and her studying it. So I think if anything, once again, this proves R.L. Stine is a horror fan's horror fan, and um, much in the same way as when you're an adolescent, you want the thrills and the chills and the spookiness. As you grow, as someone who's interested in these kinds of things, you become less afraid of it and more just overtly knowledgeable of it. And I think the shift from Haunting Hour to, or the shift from Goosebumps to Haunting Hour kind of reflects that, because I think R.L. Stine knows, because he was this kind of horror fan, that there are plenty of people who are like him who will also be going through a similar phase.
Hmm. Neat. Hmm. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add, except like maybe how I do it. But honestly, I really wouldn't do much different. Maybe just update the visuals.
Yeah, and get to the episodes that hadn't been gotten to yet. But honestly, um, the good thing about technology being what it is I think the best route for continuing Goosebumps would be for for a fan group who wants to do it to get R.L. Stine's permission, and then to have them do it online as like a series of, like a YouTube web series sort of thing,
Hmm.
would be how I would want to see Goosebumps continued.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm sure there's enough people in both, our generation as well as the generation underneath us, um who love Goosebumps and who have been fans of both the books and the series, because I'm sure there's plenty of people who grew up on the series as well as the books, who would absolutely love to be involved in a continuation of Goosebumps. And there are plenty of young actors who are waiting for their big break, who I'm sure would love to lend their talents to some Goosebumps material. And the great thing about Goosebumps is they're simple enough that the books themselves are basically the outline of the script. All you need to do is translate what's in the book to the screen, and boom, you're off to the races. There's not really a whole lot in the books that can't be translated to the screen in like a TV format, and that might be one of the reasons why the TV series did so well, because there wasn't as much of a adaptational barrier to Goosebumps.
I mean, I would like to redo some
Yeah,
episodes.
like some of the classics I could definitely see them like I'm just saying, there's no need to rush into remaking something
Oh yeah,
like
no,
the haunted
I
the
completely
haunted mask or the Night of the Living Dummy. Like those border on classics, as do the books, and they can survive being left alone. And because of how many Goosebumps books there were, I'm honestly a little bit more interested in seeing some of the ones that didn't make it to the screen the last time around first. But sure, I mean, if you're gonna do a Goosebumps web series, you're gonna revisit Night of the Living Dummy or Haunted Mask or Monster Blood sooner or later.
Oh, no, I was going to redo my two favorite ones. Like I say, update the visuals a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, if anything, I would probably not do exact copies, like note for note of the books.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would still be faithful to the book, obviously. It's just more of,
Mm-hmm. I think an episode like Attack of the Mutant would be fun to do in this day and age, just because there's been so much progress made in terms of the comic book genre.
yeah, that's
And
kind of what I wanted to do. Is like, yeah, I would like to see that kind of like maybe there's Attack of the maybe there's like a comic book that tells the events, but the events of the episode were like a comic, and it's now being added adapted
adapted.
into a movie, and essentially that's allowing the mass mutant to come back again via the movie, and like the actor who's playing the mutant or whatever.
Gets possessed by the spirit of the mutant himself, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just
I'd be interested to see R.L. Stein's take on that, given how popular the comic book medium has become as a source of stories recently.
yeah. I think that's it for our. Unless we have anything else to say.
No, I think I'm good. We can move on to the next
Oh yeah,
thing.
cartoon Halloween specials is our topic 2. I knew that was. I knew eventually we were going to get there. I just didn't want to tip our hat with it like in our first week or so.
Mm-hmm.
So just kind of list a couple of them is like kind of my first thing.
Um. Okay. You can start. I have a couple that I always think of, but they're not like the super traditional ones. So why don't you start and we'll go from there.
Okay, so there's Ed and Eddie's Boo Ha Ha, which is like one of my favorites. There is. It's technically not a Halloween episode, but it's well, Gravity Falls is kind of a Halloween show if you think about it. So
Yeah,
some
yeah. Gravity Falls as a show really does lend itself to the sort of Halloween mindset, if you like. Um, I actually not to rain on your parade or anything, but I never liked Ed and Eddie's Boo Ha Ha. I think had Ed and Eddie's Halloween episode happened earlier, like in the original run of episodes, it might be better. But the later seasons had a little bit of a stylistic change that I don't think helped the show well when it came to stuff like that.
I don't mind it.
One that I've always made sure to revisit year after year is the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy Halloween episode.
Oh, speaking of which, Underfist.
Which, to be fair, I didn't like nearly as much as the jacked up Halloween, which I finally remember the name of. Um, I get what they were going for, but I think Underfist was a little bit too on the nose, and it sort of highlights the difference between early years of Billy and Mandy and later years of Billy and Mandy. Later years of Billy and Mandy were a little bit more on the nose when it came to the comedy, and they were more into the absurd humor.
Well, to be
Whereas,
fair, Underfist was kind of technically a backdoor pilot.
and I am sad it failed, because say what you want about Billy and Mandy, but its use of minor characters was spectacular. And the fact that Billy and Mandy is technically in the Hanna-Barbera family always benefited it. Um, like for example, the way that characters from um, Codename Kids Next Door would pop up in Billy and Mandy, or the way that they called Scooby Doo as a witness in probably the most iconic and landmark episode of the series, which was the Keeper of the Reaper two-parter, which I the only time I've ever actually held any kind of dislike for Mandy was when I learned she was mean to Scooby Doo. Because I mean, good God, woman! Like there's mean for the sake of being mean, and then there's being mean to Scooby Doo. God damn you!
I'll be honest, I never liked Billy or Mandy.
No, they were both kind of annoying, but given the choice, I would much rather hang out with Mandy than Billy, because
I would prefer to
Billy,
hang out with Grimm, to be honest.
yeah. Also interesting. This is a bit of a sidebar, but interesting thing about Billy and Mandy and their bet with Grimm and how it all panned out. I don't think they ever addressed this, but Billy and Mandy have basically found themselves basically having backdoor immortality, because the living embodiment of death is their friend, and friends don't let friends die. So even though immortality was never explicitly the purpose of the bargain they struck with Grimm, it was just to make him be their friend forever. As a result of him being the Grim Reaper, when you sit there and think about it, they've kind of stumbled half-assedly into immortality, which means they've accidentally accomplished something that people who've actively tried to manage that have failed to do.
Hmm. Yeah. So I guess we kind of move on to like your favorite Halloween special for a cartoon.
My favorite cartoon Halloween special. Um, hmm. I don't know, because there's a lot of really good ones. I know the one I always make a point to revisit is Billy and Mandy's Jacked Up Halloween. But in terms of my favorites, that probably has to go to a show, a movie that first appeared on, I believe it was Cartoon Network, which was a Scooby-Doo movie entitled Scooby-Doo and the Goblin King.
Oh yeah.
That that movie is one of the few Scooby-Doo related things that actually take place during Halloween, and it shows because it's very Halloween from its floor to its rafters.
Hmm. I barely remember that movie.
I try to rewatch it at least once every year. The movies I n- never forget to revisit without fail are actually live action, like the Halloween Town movies. the Disney Channel released when I was a kid. I always revisit the first three of those. The fourth one is shit and should not be mentioned because my God, why? But the first three are very eerie and tolerable. I think they got a little bit worse as they went on, but they're still at least watchable.
Mm-hmm. Kind of the same thing. It's a movie. It's not exactly as special itself. Scary Godmother.
Oh, I remember Scary Godmother. Both of those were very cute. Although I remember watching the second one before I watched the first one.
Yeah, I think they're both fun and enjoyable. I think, moreover, I wish they had gotten a continuation with that. I
I
think,
honestly, I honestly wish that had gotten a series.
yeah, I will say though that the computer animation was a little stiff at times, but I think overall it was pretty good.
Honestly, that gave it a charm in and of itself. Um, the stilted quality of the animation kind of reminds me a little bit of like classic stop motion almost.
Yeah, yeah. I did like the design, like the art style, a lot.
Yeah.
Uh,
Although I wonder what one would have to do within that universe to have a scary godmother because it seems as though it's a thing that happens to multiple kids and yet we only ever see it happen to Hannah.
I don't know. Oh, that's a good question. Um, yeah. So, kind of our last topic. Halloween songs, favorite and why? And to kind of keep it in a broad sense, by Halloween I do mean like the kind of essence of Halloween, than specifically relating to Halloween itself.
I'd say pretty much anything that's released by Aurelio Voltaire probably counts.
I knew you
Um,
were going to say it, so that's kind of why I made sure this.
yeah, in terms of like go-to Halloween songs, one of my favorites that I'm sure not a lot of people have thought of, but there's a song called Witch's Brew by David Casper, which was most famously used in the credits of Halloween Town 2, Calabar's Revenge, which is where I know it from and why I always associate it with Halloween. But that song is very Halloween to its essence as well. But of course, the most famous ones are probably "I Put a Spell on You" from I, "I Put a Spell on You," especially the version from Hocus Pocus, sung by Bette Midler. Um, I would also say, um, in terms of things that make you nostalgic or make you think of Halloween, the song "It's Terror Time Again" from Scooby Doo on Zombie Island, which is where I first heard it, um, is another one, as well as speaking of Scooby Doo related songs, uh, the song "Hex Girls" from Scooby Doo and the Witch's Ghost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, took a lot of the good songs, but so you know what? A kind of semi-classic. This is Halloween by Marilyn Manson.
This is all of it.
The one by Marilyn Manson.
I never liked the Manson version. I always preferred the version from Nightmare Before Christmas. But
I'm obviously fucking with you, but yeah. So I like the original version. I mean, I've used it a few times in our intros for
yeah,
Hot Summer. I that and a few things by Voltaire. Uh, when You're Evil, In Disguise, Land of the Dead, the one we previously played. A couple others. Well,
Brain. Hell in the Handbasket is one of my favorites as well.
yeah. Well, a few are technically not related to Halloween. They are, again, they have the essence of kind of Hallows Eve.
Yeah, every song he has a very dark, gothic, whimsical vibe to it. So
Mhm.
all of them are kind of Halloween applicable.
Yeah, so I like those, and
There's
another.
there's another one that I forgot to mention. It's an old school one, probably even older than Monster Mash. It's called Hush by Henry Hall. It's a song about children essentially running from the boogeyman, and it very much fits the sort of classic
Oh,
Halloween
Oogie Boogie song.
from Nightmare Before Christmas.
Yeah, that, and also um, what was that one? I had it, but I lost it. Oh, from the Corpse Bride, Die, Die, Die. We all pass away, I believe. Yeah, I think that's it. It took me a second to remember it. It's fun and jovial, even though it's about people that have
Died.
died. Yeah. Um. So yeah, that's kind of our list of things, and now we will move on to reacting, watching, and reviewing a video by Renegade Cut. Um, Dracula, and I will pull that up actually now. One moment. Yeah. So this is by Renegade Cut, Bram Stoker's Dracula. This was released about 2 years ago, so it is a little old, but Halloween itself is kind of timeless. So,
Yeah.
wait, is this? Nope. Okay. Um, and I do have to say this. So, uh, now to be clear, we aren't attacking anyone. We are simply doing this for argument's sake. Again, we are simply looking at this objectively and will provide arguments when or if needed.
That being said, for most of this episode, Leon pushes a narrative like a motherfucker.
Oh yeah,
So
I kind of remember this. It's been a while since because I posted this like what, like a week before the first week of October.
yeah,
So that was like the last time I had seen it, but I kind of remember what he was talking about. Again, we do disagree with him on certain things, but more often than not, this is just us doing it simply to have a
yeah.
discussion.
This is just us essentially trying to provide the other half of the story that he didn't give. And given the sort of professorial way that Leon phrases things that leave people with the impression that his is the only perspective on this particular matter, and how very ideological he gets, uh, both uh, dumping on traditional sexuality, Victorian values, and also his particular version of history. Yeah, I'm not pulling my punches on this one,
right?
especially given that he dumps on a lot of vampire lore in the process of essentially being very selective about what he chooses to interpret and what he doesn't.
And I know I'm going to say this a few times, and I think I've said it a few other times as well, is that people tend to forget these were different times. It's not like it is now today. This different time period, different priorities, different values and stuff.
Yeah,
It's
and further to that, and this is really my crux of the issue, I don't think that people were very different back then. But I but the thing of it is, we look at this history through a very one-sided lens, and tend to we don't tend to read things in the spirit in which they were intended very often. Uh, See that this is a problem with a lot of these analytical videos. They attempt to look at these things through like a quasi anthropological lens of distance, but in the process, they always forget or discount or ignore the literal interpretation as well as the interpretation the people involved in these time periods actually gave to things. Because, of course, it's not a new thing for people to analyze these kind of moral topics through these various lenses. But I think it's a mistake for us to view view these materials through a lens other than the one that the people who put that lens in there in the first place are objectively intending for us to look at things through. Like people who did the things that they did would would have a rationale. Now you can disagree with that rationale or you can agree with that rationale. I personally mostly disagree with both the hyper traditionalistic and hyper deconstructive um, ways of interpreting this, but I think it's important to start out not strawmanning people, especially historical figures who are obviously not here any longer to defend themselves. I think we have a duty to look at as much of the data as presents itself when looking back on things, especially again when people can't or don't have the resources to defend themselves. And it's extremely disingenuous to read your own perspective into things without taking into account the perspective of the people who do those things in the first place. I will attempt to clarify what I mean as we get into this. I know that came out more babbling than I thought it would. My throat is very dry because I should probably get something to drink right now. But let's get into it and we'll see how long I can go without needing to refresh myself.
about it's 11 minutes, dude. If you want to get a drink, I say get a drink now.
All right, I'll be back. Entertain the people.
Well, hello. I don't know what I'm doing because I am a socially awkward weirdo. Um, well, as Dawn is away for the moment, I will try and look for something to read to you. Something creepy, I suppose. You know what? I will look up something from Edgar Allan Poe. Okay. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a napping, as of some one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow of the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here for evermore. And in the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain, thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door." Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This is it and nothing more. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitant, hesitating then no
Hesitating then
longer.
no longer. I I threw open the shutters that my soul could not ignore.
"Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you kept tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and never and nothing more." And that is all I will read for now.
Yes, I have returned and I have liquidated myself with some beverage. So huzzah.
Okay. Ironically enough, I finished mine. But I should be good for now. Okay.
Okay. So let us proceed with the Children of the Night and what music, whatsoever they make.
Right.
That's right.
Bram Stoker's Dracula, Renegade Cut.
Open up God's madman. All of us. Bram Stoker's Dracula is a 1992 horror film directed by Francis Ford Coppola. In 1462, after a successful battle against the Ottoman Empire, Dracula returns home to find his wife, Elisabetta, has committed suicide. She was tricked
Banana.
Okay.
Or rather, jack-o'-lanterns.
Yeah, jack-o'-lanterns.
into believing he had died. Dracula, believing God should have protected Mina due to his victory in the name of the Lord, renounces his faith and swears he will rise from the grave with all the powers of darkness. In 1897, Jonathan Harker travels to Transylvania to finalize a real estate purchase for Count Dracula. He is imprisoned.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
Well, actually, is that like close to the plot in the book, or was there changes made?
Okay, so yes and no, because see the thing about most novels, back in the Victorian era, is um they weren't usually narrated as though they were fictional. They were narrated as though the author in question was telling the story of something that actually happened, like a folk legend or something. In the case of Dracula, this was taken to its sort of logical extreme by having the majority of the story told from the perspective of letters, um, to and from the characters throughout the book. So essentially, in the style of writing of the Victorian era, most novels were rather facetiously framed as though they were things that actually happened. So, yes, as far as the events described in those letters, Bram Stoker's Dracula is probably the most accurate version of Dracula we've had. But the thing about the Francis Ford Coppola version is his was probably the first mainstream big budget version of Dracula that tied together the historical figure of Dracula, i.e. Vlad Tepes, Dracula of Romania, and the fictional Count Dracula of Bram Stoker's imagining. Now, granted, we always knew that Bram Stoker based his version of Dracula on, at least partly, on the historical Romanian figure of Count Dracula. But it was always, or should I say very often, ignored in a lot of different versions of the story. So it was Francis Ford Coppola's version that not only kept the references to Dracula that were in the original story, but also kind of upped them by giving Dracula this particular backstory here. But other than that, jack-o'-lanterns. Or I guess root beers and Gatorade and
No. Citrus drop.
I am currently working my way through my second Gatorade.
I never liked Gatorade. All right. With that, jack-o'-lanterns.
Yeah.
While Dracula seeks out his fiancée, Mina, believing she is the reincarnation of his wife. Mina's friend, Lucy, is seduced by Dracula's powers, and soon Mina finds herself in his thrall too. Harker escapes and marries Mina. Enraged by this, Dracula becomes more aggressive, murdering Lucy.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
Okay.
Abraham Van Helsing assists Harker, Lucy's fiancé, and her other suitors in finding and defeating Dracula. In the end, Mina is saved and Dracula is killed. Christianity and the battle between good and evil flow throughout the story. The novel and the film are mired in faith and critical of it. Dracula.
Okay, and right here is where we start with the foobar myth. Okay, how to proceed with this? Okay, the idea of reducing the entirety of the supernatural down to it's just Christianity versus the supernatural is kind of ridiculous when you consider that the Victorian era is when movements like spiritualism and the quote unquote Western occult revival started. So even to say something like Bram Stoker's Dracula is explicitly Christian is a little bit ridiculous, especially when you consider that the kind of Christianity that features in Dracula, both book and movie, is not even the most popular version of Christianity of its day. In a lot of cases, the more quote unquote liberally minded Protestants of the Victorian era look down on the focus on supernatural ritualism that Catholicism had, and even Catholicism looked rather sideways on the mysticism of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was very, very popular in places like Romania, Hungary, and the adjoining Eastern European countries, where Bram Stoker got the vast majority of his lore for Dracula from. So to try and reduce this down to just Christianity versus everything else is extremely disingenuous of you, and I think it's because you're going to frame this as, oh dear, my poor pearls over the idea of traditionalistic Western Christian values and etc. But we'll get into that as you actually get into them, Leon. But yeah, this even just choosing this particular narrative, I already find this highly suspect.
Also, keep in mind, within the first minute, there was nothing in this video. Nothing grabbing or anything.
Well, okay, to be fair, he was trying to succinctly summarize.
Well, no, I
the
understand that.
things
It's just
that happened.
with these videos, you have to make sure you have an opener that grabs people.
Honestly, I think his style generally is not having an opener is itself kind of jarring and distinctive, given that so many of these types of videos waffle on for like 2 minutes before they actually get into the substance of their videos. So
Actually, that is fair. I will. Okay, so I retract my previous statement because it wasn't anything critical or anything. So
yeah, I'm honestly just glad he made it through roughly 30 seconds without taking any editorial license with the plot for the most part.
yeah,
Because Lord knows Movie Bob would have already jumped in with 1,000 half-hearted, snarky, backhanded comments about every political vein under the sun. So yeah, you managed to make it through almost a minute without editorializing, and for this I am grateful, Leon.
I have never seen this movie, by the way, and I feel like I should.
It is a very good movie, and it is a very good Dracula adaptation. So I would highly recommend it. There's some bits that of course are up for the sake of like sensationalism and basically turning it into a modern blockbuster, but nothing that's terribly egregious.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dracula himself is a perversion of Jesus Christ. He promises everlasting life to all those who accept him. Renfield receives this promise only to be killed after the madman's betrayal.
Okay, what? Okay, Leon, why? Why are you framing this in explicitly Christian? Sorry. Why are you framing this in explicitly Christian terms when the lore of the vampire is pretty much as old as human civilization? Regardless of whether he was meant to be, for the sake of, the meta-narrative, a perversion of Christ or not, he would still have the qualities of a vampire. Because the qualities you're describing as Christ-like are just shit that vampires have as a default. And the consumption of blood that vampires engage in has absolutely bumfuck nothing to do with a perversion of the Holy Sacrament, unless you happen to be a medieval Christian priest, because they had to find Christian reasons for keeping whatever pagan lore they decided to keep. And you know this, Leon. I know you've done videos responding to like Kirk Cameron Saving Christmas, which does exactly the kind of Christian apologia that you or yourself are currently engaging in, as though there's nothing wrong with it. I don't understand this. Blood isn't impure or supernatural in this case because it's a perversion of the Holy Sacrament. Blood is important to vampires and supernatural entities because blood is the physical embodiment of essentially the purest and most primal form of life energy. To drink of someone's blood is to literally drink of their primal life force, and that has always been, religion be damned, the modus operandi of the vampire. So there is absolutely nothing particularly Christ-like or anti-Christ-like about Dracula beyond the fact that he is a traditional vampire. Yes, they put it in Christian terms, but that's just because Victorians understood things in Christian terms, and what amounts to Christian apologia of vampire lore was by then fully in full swing. And the fact that Francis Ford Coppola decided to apply what was in the original text, and as you'll get into, he doesn't always even follow through on that, but the fact that he tried to adapt what was in the original text rather than monkeying with it is not some indictment of the film or an indictment of the original source material. It's just Bram Stoker reached for whatever lore was handy, and because Christianity was the dominant spiritual force of the moment, a lot of that was Christianized because Christians stole pre-Christian and pre-Abrahamic lore, and they Christianized it because they had to find some apologetics way of hammering it into an otherwise non-Christian context. Yeah, but again, it's extremely disingenuous to reduce this down to, but my Christianity, stroke my traditionalism. And it baffles me that in one video, like the Kirk Cameron Saving Christmas video, you can fully acknowledge the kind of apologia that early Christians, particularly in the medieval era, engaged in to take pre-Christian lore and hammer it into Christianity. And then in videos like this, you will straight up engage in exactly that kind of apologia because you have a narrative to push about how bad um about how bad the approaches to like sex and gender roles were in traditionalistic societies like the Puritans and the Victorians. So I just the cognitive dissonance and disingenuousness here is fucking baffling. Fucking hell. Jack-o'-lanterns.
The blood of Dracula to attain her immortality, much in the same way that sacramental wine represents or becomes the blood of Christ. Dracula tells Parker that blood is too precious a thing in these days. Hey!
Sorry, I have been handed my check for my job last night.
Ah, well, good news and congratulations. I will now literally drink to you because I can.
Right, I'm going to have to move this back just because I was. Okay.
After the madman's betrayal, Mina ingests the blood of Dracula to attain her immortality, much in the same way that sacramental wine represents or becomes the blood of Christ. Dracula tells Parker that blood is too precious a thing in these days. He recounts his lineage, his bloodline, the significance of blood.
Leon, the ingestment of blood in a vampiric fashion has absolutely bumfuck nothing to do with the Holy Sacrament or anything adjacent to the Holy Sacrament. It has to do with the literal occult significance of blood, because blood is the medium that contains the more primal and animalistic forms of life energy in occult significance. Thereby, by ingesting the blood of dead things, you essentially corrupt yourself with the kind of supernatural immortality given by being a member of the living dead. It has nothing to do with transubstantiation or fucking communion or anything like that. It has simply to do with if you take in the blood of something that is not living, you are essentially, metaphysically speaking, taking in the kind of spiritual corrosiveness that the vampire himself or themselves has. That is the occult significance of blood as it pertains to the vampire. That's why very often in certain vampire stories, not only does someone have to drink, not only does someone have to be bitten by a vampire in order to become a vampire, they also have to ingest of their own free will vampire's blood to essentially complete a metaphysical circuit. Because what's happening when someone is converted into a vampire is they take in the dark, corruptive, unnatural energies of the vampire, and then in order for that circuit to be complete some of the time, again, not in all cases of vampirism, but in some of the time, essentially the person in question has to take in that blood of their own free will to complete the circuit, to draw a connection between the person that turns them into a vampire and themselves, to make it a full loop instead of just a one-way transaction.
I think the word you're looking for is sire.
Yeah.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Well, that's how I learned it anyway. That's
it's not something unique to Buffy, but yeah, in like pop culture terms, that is probably the best way of putting it. Basically, in some versions of vampirism, all that needs to happen is the vampire in question needs to bite. This kind of creates a bit of a gray area, though, because of course that implies that the person in question doesn't have to consent to being a vampire. But in the case of where the person also has to willingly take of the vampire's blood themselves rather than just being taken of, it essentially creates a loop or completes a circuit in between the victim of the vampire and the vampire itself, so that the dark energies of the vampire begin to flow both ways rather than just in a one-way direction, therefore making it a much more sustainable transformation. I don't remember if in Dracula that needed to be a thing. I vaguely remember something like that, at least in this version. But yeah, it has nothing to do with the sacraments of blood or wine or what have you. It has to do with the literal metaphysical significance that blood was given as a spiritual icon, essentially. As what essentially amounts to as a spell ingredient. That's why so many spells call for blood and why there's such a thing in occult circles as blood magic, at least as a concept. And I'm willing to bet that you would know this if you weren't trying to push the ew, traditionalism and Victorianism were so icky, though, narrative.
so
But
you're
anyway,
throwing
yeah,
away a can.
jack-o'-lanterns.
In Christianity raises the conflict between Van Helsing and Dracula to that of a holy war. Dracula himself was a soldier in a holy war. In the opening of the film, the narrator says that he protected all of Christendom from Muslim Turks. When the clergymen tell Dracula that his wife, Elisabetta, is condemned to hell due
Okay, Leon. The purpose of the intro, at least as far as I understand it, isn't to frame the movie in any more Christian terms than it already had. The purpose of the intro to the movie is Francis Ford Coppola drawing the very necessary connection between the historical Dracula, Vlad Tepes Dracula of Romania, and the literary Dracula, i.e., the one who was made famous by Bram Stoker. the movie can make it entirely without this. And whatever Christian symbolism there is in the movie, and I'm not even so sure I'm willing to grant that, will still be there entirely regardless of this point. And this this scene does nothing to make the Christian connection any stronger unless you're actually pushing a narrative like you seem to be. It's just there to make the connection between the historical figure and the literary figure, which has absolutely bumfuck nothing to do with Christianity beyond the fact that, yes, the historical Dracula was a Christian. Brainwashed by Muslims for the majority of his, early childhood and whatnot, hence why he's so fucking homicidal to the Turks after he gets out and retakes his kingdom, because they tortured him for most of his young life, and then he retaliated by torturing them for the rest of his adult life. If anything, this is a sign of why abused people shouldn't be left to the devices of dealing with their own abusers, but that's neither here nor there. But again, has very little to do with Christianity beyond the fact that the historical figure of Dracula was Christian, and the lore of the late Middle Ages that Bram Stoker was borrowing from had been mostly Christianized by people who took pre-existing, pre-Christian traditions and put a Christian skin on them so that they could be added to the Christian lexicon, basically. But anyway, jack-o'-lanterns.
To her suicide, he renounces his faith, questions how a benevolent God could damn his wife, and he strikes the cross with his sword. He drinks the blood and gains a perverted kind of eternal life. Parker would not normally wear a crucifix. It was a gift for protection. The novel's Harker refers.
Okay. There's something worth saying about the cross, or what he says about the cross, and we'll get into it in the next bit. But I'm gonna level with everybody. The scene where Dracula stabs the cross and the cross bleeds for some reason genuinely does confuse me. So I'm willing to just throw my hand up and go, I don't fucking know what's happening in this regard, but I don't think it has anything to do with perverting Christianity beyond the simple art house blockbuster shock value of it. Because of course this was made in the 90s when that probably still would have gotten quite a few gas shock horrors in the audience and whatnot. But yeah, I don't think the bleeding cross imagery has anything to do with him renouncing Christianity. I think it has more to do with his loss of innocence and his alliance with darkness just as a general rule. I don't think it has anything specifically to do with Christianity. I think Francis Ford Coppola wanted to convey his loss of innocence and his renunciation of pure things, and the most over-the-top way he could think to accomplish this was by having a cross that by rights had no mechanism to bleed. So there's that. But again, like I said, this scene confuses me, so I'm just willing to go, I don't fucking know, and move on. I just don't think that Leon has any more fucking clue about why the cross leads in that scene than I do in this case. And I think he very much has a narrative to push. That narrative, of course, being, ew, Christianity and by extension traditionalism is icky because reasons. Or the other way around, ew, traditionalism and by extension Christianity is icky because reasons. But as we'll soon see, that has a lot of fucking issues with it. But let's jack-o'-lantern and we can go on with the next bit.
To himself as an English churchman, meaning Protestant, whereas wearing a cross around the neck at that time would be more Catholic. There is a great deal of commentary about the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in the novel, but in Coppola's film, Christianity is instead streamlined into a singular force against the darkness.
Because, Leon, the fact that it's Christian really has nothing to do with anything. If anything, um, if anything, Christianity is used in Bram Stoker's Dracula merely as a means to fight the supernatural. And the fact that it is Christianity has almost next to nothing to do with anything. For example, uh, most of the actual members of the church used to throw an absolute shit fit over peasants using things like garlic and woosbane to defend themselves from supernatural attack. Why? Because it was considered essentially pagan peasant magic, um, and therefore not within the purview of the church. The idea of using religious icons um, to fight supernatural entities really was an affectation of the early medieval Catholic Church, more so than anything else. Most of the other methods of dealing with vampires and shit had to do with these particular herbs or um, spices or attributes of nature that essentially were toxic to the darkness in an universal kind of objective sort of way. So the fact that we see Van Helsing using garlic and wolfsbane and the like um, in Bram Stoker's Dracula at least implies that Francis Ford Coppola, if he had any direct input over this at all, and I'm not convinced he did, um, wasn't really going yay Christianity through the majority of the movie, even though he may have been, because a true churchman of this time period probably would have snubbed their nose at, again, what was essentially considered cheap pagan peasant magic. Whereas most, country folks and wise women and cunning men, which were essentially the shamans and sorcerers and wizards of the country at around the same time, would have looked at the use of religious iconography as superstitious, ridiculous, dogmatic, um, pompous church magic. Either way, for most of particularly medieval history, these two didn't commingle until Victorian era, when things started to break down a little bit, and they realized religion doesn't have all the answers, so let's apply some practical understanding of this shit. And most of the practical understanding they applied was from older times the church had either co-opted or just straight up ignored. Jack-o'-lantern.
What Dracula calls trinkets of deceit position the conflict as a holy war. Van Helsing's armaments are religious, specifically his use of the crucifix as a weapon. An interesting choice for the film is that the aforementioned Christian symbols from the novel are no longer all powerful, rather than the ultimate.
Okay. Okay. Leon, they were never all powerful. Because if you look into metaphysical philosophy, you see the notion, and I grant you that this was a notion outside of religious doctrine for most of human history. I'll grant you that. But in most more universalistic metaphysical circles, the power delivered through religious icons is reliant upon the power bestowed onto those religious icons. Basically, best case scenario, religious icons are empty circuit boards that have no power unless power is conferred onto them. You essentially need to use the energy of your faith to power these icons. Essentially, think of it like a circuit board, and then you, as you as basically the power supply for that circuit board, charging that circuit board with energy, thereby making the circuit board function. That's how metaphysical icons tend to work. And that's also why, I know you're going to get into this in the near future, that's also why the icons used in the movie have less power than they by right should. Because as you just went into there, Leon, Jonathan Harker is an English churchman, meaning he subscribes to the doctrine of the Church of England. And the Church of England doesn't hold well with the power of icons like the cross. Hence, Jonathan Harker has no faith in the cross, and therefore he is not devoting any energy through that faith to that icon, which is why that icon is significantly less powerful than it otherwise would be. And it's implied that just as Jonathan Harker doesn't bestow the symbol of the cross with any particular power, so to the priest that you mentioned in about 2 seconds is a priest who has lost his faith, or who never really had much faith to begin with, and therefore he lacks the power of conviction to bestow onto the cross. And really, when you think about it, it doesn't really make much sense, even from a Christian perspective, for a crucifix to hold power. Why? Because the crucifix was the thing used to torture Jesus. And in what rational religion is the thing used to kill and torture your Messiah supposed to be endowed with some divine significance? Like, I know his sacrifice was important and all, but like that's like a religion based on the victims of mass shooters brandishing a gun as though it's a religious symbol. It doesn't really make much logical or intuitive sense unless you take it on the basis of the cross is essentially a circuit board that the energy of your faith or the energy of your intent charges. In the same way, a circuit board is basically meaningless unless it's tied to some form of electricity. But anyway, jack-o'-lanterns.
Ultimate weapon against evil, the crucifix is easily destroyed by the power of vampires. The brides hiss at Harker's crucifix and dissolve it into liquid. Dracula, in his demonic bat form, sets another crucifix on fire simply by looking at it and stamping his foot. Lucy vomits blood on Van Helsing's crucifix.
And again, I just explained the reason why. It's because the symbol itself is basically like an empty circuit board. Yes, if you put energy into it, it can shape that energy into a more effective form. But if you don't put any energy into it, well, let's just try it. Trying to use an iPad after it has been unplugged for long enough to wear the battery down. I don't think you're going to get anywhere because there's no energy flowing from the source of the energy to the object, and therefore it's going to be relatively useless. The same principle applies. The crucifix can make the energy you're using more efficient, but if you don't put any energy into it, then you are essentially brandishing a circuit board that's been unplugged for too long. And that's why the vampires are able to just basically throw them off as though they're meaningless, because no one is conferring them with any power. And just like a gun with no bullets in it isn't going to terrify anyone, so too a crucifix with no power in it is going to basically just be a minor nuisance at best. But anyway, jack-o'-lanterns.
From the release of the novel until the release of Coppola's film, we see a decline in Christian power, or at least the greater freedom to question that faith. The cold condemnation of the priest and Dracula's more sympathetic portrayal than in other versions are more evidence of this. In the book Reading the Vampire, Ken Gelder claims that
Okay, this is a thing that you could argue has happened, but I don't see any relevance to this beyond the fact that you're pushing a EU Christianity and EU traditionalism narrative. So I call shenanigans and we move on. Jack-o'-lanterns.
But Dracula and perhaps other vampires are modeled on anti-Semitic stereotypes, the bizarre and false caricature of its time, a blood-sucking, baby-stealing Jew. If this attitude is shocking, bear in mind that Victorian society was notorious for both its attempts at pious Christian morality and for its hypocrisy. The idea that
There's
Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay, I don't know. I'm going to assume you agree with this person, Leon, because you're referencing her, and you appear to be referencing her to give your own ideas weight, and that's fine. You can agree with whoever you like, and you can defer to whoever you like and whoever you find to be intelligent and useful. I defer regularly to people I find to be interesting and whatnot, so that's fine. But I will say to both you and this person that you appear to be referencing, I think you might have the causality backwards there, because there's nothing there's nothing traditional about the Jew that makes one think they would be blood-sucking, baby-stealing demons. However, if you want to vilify someone, it is very useful to view them in blood-sucking, baby-stealing terms, because blood-sucking and baby-stealing are almost universally seen as bad things. So, in other words, Leon, to put it simply, I think that rather than having the vampire based on anti-Semitic stereotypes, I think those anti-Semitic stereotypes are trying to correlate the idea of a Jewish person with the vampire to make the Jewish person seem less desirable. It's the same thing that happened with witches and people who weren't Christians back in the Middle Ages. The easiest way to vilify your proposed enemy is to make them seem like terrible, horrible, blood-sucking, baby-stealing, animalistic demons who have no moral senses or intellectual curiosity, and so on. Hence, witches in the Middle Ages were viewed as scantily clad women who would often dance naked and who ate babies and made crops fail on purpose and so forth. And hence, the idea of the Jew took on characteristics similar to the vampire because those characteristics, the idea of the Jew shared with the idea of the vampire, are universally bad things. I don't think someone saw a Jewish stereotype and gave those attributes to the idea of the vampire. I think instead someone saw vampire stereotypes and they needed to find a way to make Jews seem less than human, so they gave some of those vampiric stereotypes to the Jew to make the Jew seem less human and therefore easier to dehumanize. So, in other words, your narrative is fucked because you literally have it exactly backwards. The vampire is not meant to be Jewish. The Jewish person is meant to be vampiric, so as to make it easier to dehumanize them. Jack-o'-lantern.
and for its hypocrisy. The idea that carnal desire, for example, was unaccounted for is something of a myth. Discussing sex, rather, was unacceptable. Of course, sex still happened, obviously, but it was not only private, but shameful. The strict moral codes drove people to.
Okay, here is where you, Leon, and I'm glad you addressed this because yes, it is wrong to assume that previous generations simply had less sex than we do. But you also got it wrong in the sense that the act of sex in and of itself was not shameful. the idea of enjoying sex too much is what was shameful, because enjoying things was essentially seen as an indulgence, and the purpose of sex in the traditionalist mindset was essentially the highest form of what was referred to as the generative instinct, i.e., you were supposed to use sex for procreative purposes and not to enjoy it. And because these were extremely repressed fucks who essentially viewed any tendency toward excess or enjoyment as an indulgence that was unworthy of a civilized human being, it was better to have sex and not enjoy it, because enjoying something too much was essentially to taint that thing. And this happened with virtually everything. Hell, what are the 7 deadly sins, Leon? The 7 deadly sins are lust, envy, gluttony, greed, sloth, anger, and pride. What do all of these have in common?
Wrath.
That's anger.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Never mind.
But point being, all of these sins have to do with things that in moderation are not considered sinful being taken to an excessive degree. Lust, the desire to engage in carnality or sex too much. Envy, the desire to mimic other people too much. Gluttony, the enjoyment of sensual pleasures of the Epicurean kind too much. The sin of the appetite. Greed, the enjoyment of prosperity too much. Sloth, the enjoyment of relaxation too much. Anger, the irrational giving into one's passions too much, etc. All of the main sins of the Abrahamic religion in particular are not things that you should or even would be able to completely abstain from. The idea is, what is wrong with the 7 deadly sins is they are healthy impulses taken to an excessive and therefore unhealthy degree, because in the traditionalist mind, any kind of excess was considered wasteful. In a world with extremely finite resources, using resources that you do have for anything other than their intended purpose was considered a bad thing. That's why these things are considered sinful in the first place. Because in a world where you had maybe a cow and some sheep to your name and that was it, you couldn't be a glutton. Because if you were too much of a glutton, you might kill your cow and your sheep, and then whoops, you wouldn't have a means to support yourself. You couldn't be lustful, because then whoops, we don't know who's fucking whom, and therefore we don't know who should be responsible for taking care of children and so forth. You couldn't be greedy, because if you're so focused on your own personal prosperity, you might basically cripple the rest of the community, and whoops, now we don't have a community, and so on and so on and so on. All of these are prohibitions not against the appetites that beget them, but actually the excess of those appetites. Because in a world with finite resources, excess almost invariably leads to destruction. Now, I disagree with this. The solution to desiring more things is not to consider yourself sinful or to abstain. The answer is get more things, and then you won't have to feel guilty for wanting more things. But I'm not here to crap all over traditionalism. I believe that to you. My solution to your problem, Leon, is to actually try and understand why these traditions existed in the first place. And by not actually examining why these traditions existed in the first place, you are essentially committing a very bad straw man, sir. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Double lives, an upright public life and a private life, with a facade that the latter did not exist. Sexual behavior, especially that of women, was publicly viewed as obscene. Dracula seduces Mina with his magic and his shapeshifting and hypnotic powers. This era helped popular.
Okay, Leon. The reason why public displays of anything were generally considered to be too excessive is because, again, the idea was you shouldn't be focusing on other people's private lives. You should be focusing on being a productive member of society. So anything that you were doing that was seen as non-productive was considered inherently bad. And the reason why it was particular to women is because women were supposed to be pure. And the reason why women's sexuality was particularly vilified, Leon, is because women have a greater half of the generative impulse, i.e., it's the woman's body that begets children. Therefore, the woman's generative impulse was seen as both more pure and stronger. Therefore, she should be held responsible for being more responsible with it. And any use of the generative impulse, i.e., lust, that was not something that would lead to the begetting of healthy children was considered you misusing your generative impulse. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Arise what is commonly called the Madonna whore complex, a term both in century-old psychology and sexual politics that brands women as either pure virgins or sexually promiscuous and therefore inconsequential.
He impressed me. My darling husband.
Okay. Let's talk about that virgin whore dichotomy there for a second, Leon. What does the term whore mean? I.e., who is it that we call whores, and why do we call them that? We call a woman a whore when she has come into sexual contact with too many fucking cocks. I point this out, Leon, because there is no word for a man who sleeps with too many women. That there is no shameful, dismissive word for a man who has slept with too many women. Now, you might look at that and say, well, sure, that's male privilege. Men don't have to be judged in that regard. But au contraire, because they are still judged for that. They're just not judged in quite the same way. But women have terms like slut and whore because a woman by default is considered more pure. That's the virgin dichotomy. What then makes a woman impure is not sex, but who she has sex with, i.e., the impurities of man come directly from men and therefore the penis. A slut or a whore is simply a term for woman who has or desires to touch too many fucking cocks. And we don't have a term like that for men because men are not corrupted by sex with many, many women. In fact, in many cases, a man who can convince many women to have sex with him willingly is considered more valid or more pure in the traditionalist mindset because women are the vessels of purity and men are the vessels of impurity. The only time a man is judged, or I guess to put it another way, the only way a man is judged is in the sense of if he is a whore fucker. What does a whore fucker mean in this context? A whore fucker means someone who convinced a woman to have sex with him by paying her rather than by making her want him. I bring this up, Leon, because for a man, the worst crime he can commit sexually is by making women have sex with him and not actually want it. Whether he pays them, in the case of the whorefucker insult, or if he rapes them, which again is a thing that very, very traditionally and even now, many people only think men can do to women and women cannot do to men. People are more concerned with the rape of women because, again, women are seen as more pure by default. Therefore, if they are forced to take on the impurities of a man without their consent, that is worse because they are deflowering or corrupting an otherwise pure individual. That's the other thing. In most cases, most of the insults we have for men who engage in sex are words that assign blame, i.e., you deflowered her, you took her innocence, you corrupted her, you made her impure, etc. In women, when we have these kind of attributes, it's the kind of terminology that assigns blame or victimhood, i.e., you are spoiled, you are damaged, you are victimized, etc. Because a man is seen as agentive, i.e., he made a choice willingly and therefore should be blamed for that choice. And a woman is seen as a victim who is in many ways put upon by her predicament rather than corrupted by it, because men are the corruptive ones and women are the people to be corrupted because they are already so pure. That is why there is the virgin whore dichotomy. Because again, in a traditional society, the view of sex was that sex was explicitly a generative impulse. So any form of sex that didn't generate a life at the end of it was considered a waste of a finite amount of generative impulse. That is how women were seen as corrupted, is if they misused their generative impulse. But more often, it was seen as a man actively choosing to corrupt a woman rather than a woman choosing to become corrupted. Hence why women are victims and men are corruptors in this dichotomy. Jack-o'-lantern.
Well, I was going to say, for the record, there are terms for guys. Like, well, terms I use anyway. Oh, you guys wanted to. Oh, sorry. Well, basically, they are the same words that I use to describe women, but I add my own little,
Right, but are those ones that you particularly came up with, or are those ones that society at large comes up with?
Well, there's gigolo, not gigolo. I think it's gigolo. Most of the others are ones I've come up myself.
Mm-hmm. But here's another interesting thing. Like I was saying, generally speaking, there is no equivalent word for a man who has a lot of sex with women, like whore or slut. But when a man has a lot of sex with other men in a gay way, lo and behold, the words whore and slut come back online again. I find this very interesting when you consider that, again, in the colloquial context, whore and slut usually just mean someone who is willingly engaged with too many penises. That's why there is no equivalent word like whore or slut for woman who is engaged, or woman who has engaged with too many to or rather there is no word for a woman who is engaged with too much sex in general. It's only when it's reference to a man that it becomes a problem. And usually it's the implication is you let this man have your sacred sexuality without first making him court you for it. You essentially made your sexuality cheap by allowing men to have access to it. Because again, men are the corruptors and women are the corrupted. Men are the agents in the scenario, and women are victims of that agency. But when it's men fucking other men, the words whore and slut get used again because, at least colloquially, whore and slut mean person who has touched too many cocks. Because cocks are corrupted and vaginas are purifying. In the human psyche, anyway.
I'm
What's
sorry.
funny?
It's kind of funny.
What is?
Well, just you saying cocks and vagina. It's funny to me, and that's my child humor, right, seeping through.
Well, I mean, you're 19. You're allowed to laugh at the occasional dick joke.
Oh, no, it's funny because kind of today it's kind of the opposite, to be honest.
What do you mean?
Actually, how to best say this? That in actual terms, vaginas are corrupting while dicks are kind of pure in a sense.
I don't know where you're living, but I can't think of any examples where a dick is meant to purify anything, or a vagina is supposed to corrupt anything. I have
I
heard
think
don't
it's
stick.
different how it's used, and God, I wish I hadn't said that.
I have heard the phrase "don't stick your dick in crazy," but that has more to do with the person attached to the sexual body part more so than the body part itself.
Yeah, I've actually been lucky enough that I haven't met any crazy chicks like that.
Good. And if you do, remember the old adage, don't stick your dick in crazy.
Okay, this got a weird sidebar.
It did.
All right, jack-o'-lanterns.
Jack-o'-lanterns.
In Dracula, Lucy and Mina are representative of this dichotomy. Lucy openly talks about sex, and Mina is comparatively shy until she is infected with vampirism. Lucy is subtextually punished for her deviation from Victorian norms. When Van Helsing
He's kind of only halfway to a point, so jack-o'-lanterns.
and his cohorts discover Lucy has been transformed into a vampire, Arthur penetrates her with a stake and returns her to her virginal purity, clad in white. Arthur and Van Helsing see no other choice but to return her to her more socially acceptable state, even if that is of the grave. This film adaptation portrays both.
All right, first off, vampires are kind of seen as evil, and most of the time that's correct because they kill a lot of people to drink blood.
Yeah. Okay. There's that, and further to that, Leon. The reason they are wanting to stake her and return her to her pure state is because vampires are seen as evil and fucking dark and unnatural and a perversion of the natural order, which has absolutely bumfuck nothing to do with her sexuality, other than, again, in the traditionalist Victorian and Puritan mindsets, sex was seen as the generative impulse. And someone who is using overt sexuality was seen as wasting their generative impulse. That's how sexuality was originally viewed. I personally don't agree with that. I think sexuality is first and foremost an expression of love and compassion and closeness and camaraderie and shit. But in the traditionalist mindset, which is the mindset you're attempting to diagnose here, being lusty was wrong because it was seen as excessive, and As we just covered, excesses are always seen as negative. Now, on to what I find slightly more interesting in your little tangent there. The penetration of Lucy with the stake has bumfuck nothing to do with any kind of sexual terminology, unless you yourself personally put it there. The reason why stakes were used for vampires originally was actually a relatively practical purpose. It was believed that vampires could rise from their graves, and they slept in their graves at night to essentially recharge themselves. So when a group of town people suspected a particular corpse of being a vampire, they would literally stake it to the ground so that if that vampire woke again, it could not rise from the grave, because it would literally be held there by a stake. It's funny because actually in the medieval mind, it wasn't thought that the stake actually killed the vampire so much as just inconvenienced the vampire enough to where it was no longer going to be a problem. Because now I'm actually imagining a bunch of vampires in their graves having been staked to the ground, wanting to get out and suck blood and gallivant around and whatnot, and just uselessly flailing because they had been staked through the heart, rather than actually dying as a result of that staking. And the stake to the heart thing is relatively modern invention in the way that we think of it in terms of actually, killing the vampire, unless it's of a particular kind of wood. Some particular kinds of wood were thought to be sacred and metaphysically useful, and therefore they could be used to exorcise essentially the spirit of the vampire. And sometimes stakes made of those materials in particular could be used to kill them. But usually in the medieval mind, stakes were just used to inconvenience the vampire and make it uselessly flail in its grave the next time it woke up. It had nothing to do with actually killing them. But yeah, the returning of Lucy to her natural state has nothing to do with reinstituting patriarchal traditionalist gender norms. It has everything to do with purifying the darkness that she got, incidentally, again, from a male entity, i.e., she was corrupted by Dracula. So the source of her corruption was a man again. And in both Lucy and Mina's cases, both Lucy and Mina were seen as sick, i.e., they weren't to blame for their own actions under the influence of vampirism. It was seen as Dracula, who is a man, who was the source of the corruption of Lucy and Mina. So, in other words, the problem was once again a man being corruptive and women being too pure to avoid being corrupted. Again, this has nothing to do with hatred of women or misogyny. If anything, it has to do with purifying the otherwise pure women of the negative influence of men cock again. And I know I really hate having to phrase these things in like sexual terms, but this is where he's going, so I have to kind of follow him to correct him. So yeah. If anything, this is more about, once again, the evils of Dracula's metaphorical cock than it does have anything to do with misogyny.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. God damn, I am such a child.
Well, I mean, you literally are 19, so you're excused. And believe me, I would rather not have to be talking about this, but this is the route he's going, so this is the route I will follow him now.
Okay.
Both Mina and Dracula as more romantic than in the source material, as well as most other adaptations, perhaps updating it a little past the Victorian era. But the Madonna whore complex still shows its face. Lucy cannot be saved, but Mina can. Lucy and Dracula's brides echo a concept that is both
Okay, the reason Lucy couldn't be saved is because Lucy was too far gone. Mina had not fully succumbed to her vampirism yet, whereas Lucy had gotten out of the rooms that they were contained within and actually drank blood. And it was this final consecration of her as a vampire, the consumption of innocent blood, that made her too far gone. It had nothing to do with her sexuality and everything to do with her essentially succumbing to Dracula's darkness. My previous rant about Dracula's cock being the true evil, metaphorically speaking, in this particular dichotomy. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Both a biblical tale and a facet of social politics. The idea among men that the desires of women will create a fall from grace for all. In the essay The Importance of Blood During the Victorian Era, Illifer Pectus said that the three beautiful vampires that Jonathan Harker encounters in Dracula's.
Okay. You evoked Christian imagery again, so let's actually follow this down the rabbit hole we're currently following it down. And I really wish I didn't have to talk about this, but again, he opened the Pandora's box, so now I have to. Despite Eve being the first person to eat of the tree of knowledge in the biblical story, in the Christian mythos, it was a daughter of Eve named Mary who literally gave birth to God despite her sins. Mary gave birth to Jesus despite Eve being the first person to eat of the apple of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Despite the fact that Adam's crime was only ever listening to Eve, he was never corrupt. He was never saved in the same manner as Mary was. And again, what is exactly remarkable about Mary within the Christian mythos? Mary is remarkable because she has not been corrupted by an earthly man, and therefore she is closer to God. Because women are by default pure and men are by default corrupted, therefore the way that a man spreads his corruption onto a woman is by fucking her. And therefore a virgin woman is so pure, in fact, that in the Christian mythos she can give birth to God with no intervention from a man whatsoever. It's not, and also it's not women's sexual desires that leads to a fall from grace. Hell, the first edict God gives to Adam and Eve, after the whole "do not eat of this." Actually, I think it might have been before the tree fiasco. Is be fruitful and multiply, and again, women were seen as the main vessels of the generative impulse in the sense that they could actually give birth to children. So it's not women's desires that are the problem. It's women misusing the power that their desire grants them. And once again, I'd like to point out that Eve's main crime when eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is listening to a male snake god thing. Because, Satan had taken the form of a snake or one of his demons had, depending on the version of the story you listen to. And it was through listening to this male snake that Eve was corrupted and then spread that corruption to Adam and on down the line. And despite, again, Adam's only crime being listening to Eve, and Eve's crime actually being violating God's rule under the advice of a snake, a male serpent, he is still held more liable for it than she is because centuries later, even before the Holy Sacrament of Christianity, Mary is able to give birth to the Son of God. And what's remarkable about her is that she is a virgin and therefore uncorrupted by an earthly man, and therefore pure enough, apparently, to give birth to God if she wants to. With no practical help from a man, apparently. Except, of course, for the, imagined sky god that probably, presumably, fucked her. Somehow. That's a porno that I actually wouldn't mind seeing. The sex tape between the angel Gabriel and Mary would be very fun. But that's neither here nor there.
You are so weird, Dalton.
I know.
And I think I'm weird, and I think I have a fan member that's weird. But damn, dude, you knock it out of the park in weirdness. That's not I'm not trying to insult you or anything. It's just wow.
It is what I do. It is what I do, and I am exceedingly good at it. I may be good at nothing else, but when it comes to being fucking weird, I excel. I have a very particular set of skills.
Yeah, one of them is not liking sandwiches.
Which I still can't get over how weird you think that is relative to every
I
other
think it's weird.
weird thing.
Everyone I've ever met likes sandwiches. Even vegans like sandwiches. Like vegans I know. I'm sorry, it is weird to me, and I've kind of gotten used to it, but it's just a weird thing.
Okay. Well, fair enough. And on that note, I'm screwing with Brainstormer's head yet again. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Castle represent all of the qualities of how a woman should not be: voluptuous and sexually aggressive. The Tsarina Catherine is the name of one of the ships that Dracula uses. The name of the ship is taken from the Russian Empress, Catherine the Great, whose political opponents condemned for being allegedly promiscuous.
Again, the main problem with women being promiscuous or being sexual is that they would therefore desire men, and men were corrupted. And the reason why women weren't supposed to be sexually assertive is because aggression was seen as a perversion of the generative impulse. A perversion of the generative impulse that was fine for men because men were already corrupt. Innocence is synonymous in the traditional sense with purity, and therefore it was seen as more idealistically pure for a woman to be innocent and therefore not desire to aggressively seek sex, because sex was considered to be something that was corruptive but necessary for the furthering of human civilization. Hence the be fruitful and multiply suggestion. Essentially, the difference between the traditionalist mindset and the current mindset is before, sex was considered a necessary evil that needed to be done for the sake of generating new humans. And now, sex is considered to be at best, a veneration or validation of universal love and compassion. And of course, the social justice postmodern mindset is sex is just a pleasurable act to be engaged in basically whenever. I personally prefer the second of these options. I don't think sex should be restricted to simply being a generative impulse, but I don't think it should be meaningless either. I I prefer if sex is just the universal and most extreme commitment of essentially love making. That's why it's called love making. But I'm weird that way.
Yes, you are.
And apparently Brainstormer is still thinking about all of the various ways in which I am weird.
It's hard not to. Basically, every other thing you say is a weird thing.
I do my best.
In reality, this was probably a smear tactic. The infamous horse story is apocryphal, but that's not the point. This historical reference implies that should Van Helsing and the others fail in their attempt to save Mina, she will become the same sexual creature as Lucy or the vampire brides. Our fantasies are reflections.
She would become a fucking monster, literally.
Yes, and also in the Victorian and puritanical mindsets, what was wrong with that was the creature of death that is the vampire would force her fragile mindsets. Again, here we find another example of women being victimized by their own choices, but whatever. Essentially, the corruptive nature of the vampire would force an otherwise healthy, functional human being to waste their generative impulse on aggression and sexuality as opposed to actually using that sexuality for the sake of generating new humans and being fruitful and multiplying and shit. This is the traditional understanding of sexuality that you keep missing by making this women are oppressed supposition of yours, Leon. The simple fact of the matter is the traditional definition of sexuality and the traditional uses for sexuality are significantly different from the modern definitions of sexuality. And it is this difference in definition that is making you entirely apparently incapable of saying anything that isn't a fucking ridiculous straw man. Essentially, the problem with women becoming vampires is because they are literally corrupted by sex, animalistic hunger, and death, they would waste their God-given generative impulse, the ability to create new life. And the wasting of the possibility of new life is considered a negative thing, at least within the Puritan mindset of the Victorians and, of course, the Puritans. I personally see nothing wrong with this particular supposition based on this dichotomy. It's just I don't believe in this dichotomy. But if I did believe in this dichotomy, it would be perfectly rational to me to understand the wasting of a woman's God-given generative impulse on what essentially amounts to useless sexuality, because of course vampires are by default corpses, and the notion of wasting that generative impulse is considered a universally bad thing, because if women are considered pure by default, and then they are essentially forced to waste their own power, that is a negative thing within the traditional mindset. Now, you can argue with the traditional mindset, and I have on many occasions, but please at least be aware of what you're actually arguing against, rather than the straw version, which honestly has a lot more in common with the traditional mindset than you think. But anyway, jack-o'-lanterns.
Of ourselves. And with so much sexuality intermingled with our movie monsters, there must be something there, something instinctual that we are creating when we write these stories, not even realizing it, and when we watch these films without fully comprehending why we are so attracted to these monsters. Dracula, as a novel, was meant to both.
Okay, vampires, to my understanding, represent the eternal youth kind of idea, and where a lot of people in actual history have tried. Case in point, the lady you told me about, I can't remember her name.
The secondary inspiration for Dracula, Countess Elizabeth Ossory of Hungary, who literally was so obsessed with maintaining her feminine wiles and youthful appearance that she literally murdered young women and drained their virgin blood into her bathtub and bathed in it.
Oh, bleh, bleh.
Yeah, she essentially used the blood of young women as the earliest version of what would come to be known as a moisturizer.
I'm sorry, it's just blood. But
Yeah.
Also, vampires themselves are kind of predators in a sense.
Okay, here's the thing. As far as I understand it, um, vampires are the living embodiment of um primal carnal desire in like an animalistic sense. The thing that always has made and you can make the argument that the same is true for werewolves, but the thing that always has made vampires more dangerous than werewolves is vampires can come in the guise of someone refined and aristocratic. They can come in the guise of someone who is justifiably repressing their sexual desires, whereas a werewolf is sort of the primal animal unleashed in a very practical, physical form. But that's what makes the vampire so seductive, because he can come to you in the guise of someone pure, like an aristocrat, and then get you to waste your sexuality. Again, in the traditional mindset, the sexual act was seen as an exercise of the generative impulse. That's also why witchcraft was seen as a negative thing, because in the Abrahamic mindset, witchcraft came directly from sex magic or lust magic, and therefore the magic that witches worked was seen as an extension of them wasting their generative impulse. But that's a discussion for a different day, and one that we've actually already had with Lacey Green of all people. But yeah, that's why vampires are so often linked with sex. They are the animalistic parts of human nature hidden in the guise of the most refined and upper crusty and intellectual uh, aristocratic parts of human nature. That's what makes a vampire, generally speaking, more dangerous than a werewolf, because a werewolf cannot hide their animalistic nature, whereas a vampire very much can hide their animalistic nature, and that thereby making them infinitely more dangerous. Moving on. Jack-o'-lanterns.
I thought I had something, but I forgot it.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It was on my own thing because I was thinking of it, but no, must not have been important.
Tantalize its readers with its sexually provocative imagery and still entrench it within Victorian values. As a film, some of this is expanded with nudity and sex scenes, but one aspect is diminished in Coppola's adaptation. The romantic misery of Dracula, first with his deceased wife and then with Mina,
He was kind of halfway through a point. I don't really have anything to say to that. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Okay.
designates him very strictly heterosexual, whereas the novel paints his conquests as more demonic, and from the perspective of some critics, homosexual. Jonathan's submissiveness and Dracula's command over his brides, saying that Jonathan belongs only to him, is often interpreted that way, as is Dracula's desire to penetrate Jonathan.
Okay.
That got weird.
Again, in the traditionalist mindset, the problem with homosexuality wasn't they're different from us. It was that the idea of sex was the generative impulse. And because by default a homosexual act would never lead to that generative impulse being used correctly to create new life, it was by default negative. Also, interestingly, gay men were always hated more than gay women because, of course, human beings are naturally protective of women because women are the childbearing sex. Thereby, the problem, large amount of the problem with homosexuality historically was the notion that homosexuals, by default, didn't love women. And this was seen as unnatural and corruptive and perverse, and again, a waste of the human generative impulse. That's why homosexuality was frowned upon because it was considered wasteful and excessive, and it was considered a sign that someone didn't love women. And both of these things were enough to get you shot back in the day. It had nothing to do with them being a minority. The reason why they were treated as a minority or given minority status as we would currently define it is because of those two things: the perversion of the generative impulse, the excessive nature of homosexuality under the traditional mindset, and the notion that homosexuals by default didn't love women. Jack-o'-lantern.
Nothing with his fangs. Dracula's desire is to become part of the mainstream human world through his disguise. Normally, he stays hidden away in his castle where the world can't see him. In the Victorian era, such a homosexual would be considered a monster. In the book Our Vampires Ourselves, Professor Nina Arbach wrote,
Jack-o'-lanterns.
innovative in his isolation, Dracula can do nothing more than catalyze homoerotic friendship among the humans who hunt him. His story abounds in overwrought protestations of friendship among the men who testify breathlessly to each other's manhood. In other words, Dracula mixes among the community of men, but is not.
Okay, there's nothing explicitly homoerotic about the camaraderie, which is very traditionally masculine, between the people who are hunting Dracula in the book or the movie Dracula. That is you projecting essentially sexual abstract woo where there is no sexual abstract woo. It's simply a portrayal of the kind of camaraderie that was expected to occur among upper crust Victorian gentlemen who were on good terms with each other. Yeah, and the fact that you needed to project homoeroticism rather than simple heterosexual male camaraderie is kind of telling, and that's fucking coming from a bisexual person who about 80% of the time prefers men. So you're making a borderline gay person defend heterosexual camaraderie. You stupid fuck. Jack-o'-lantern.
I do.
Allowed to join it. Again, the fact that this is a film adaptation that focuses much more attention on Dracula's romantic side, that is more exclusive to women, is a sign of the times. Demonizing homosexuality is not something to be passed down. Another fear in Victorian England was that of xenophobia.
Again, the reason why traditionally homosexuality was frowned upon had nothing to do with any of the framing you've given it, and you would understand that if you actually bothered to listen to the accounts of why traditionalist people actually said that they engaged in this behavior, because most of the time people had a better understanding of why they believed what they believed than you do. Now, granted, there were some stupid people who didn't think of things much beyond the surface this achy levels of moral and emotional outrage, but the actual thinkers of their day did have very cogent, traditionalistic, logical reasons for doing the things they did. Now, I disagree with these people. I find their logic to be somewhat self-refuting in various different ways, but there is a logic there, and your refusal to acknowledge that logic is making you commit the straw man fallacy about a dozen times a minute. But at any rate, let's jack-o'-lantern and we can get to the end of this, maybe.
And Dracula embodies this too. Dracula's lust for blood and desire to emigrate to England for nefarious purposes comes from this country's fear of foreigners. British colonialism meant acquiring control over other countries and other populations, but heaven forbid those same populations actually seek a new life in England.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
He tried to kill and eat a bunch of people.
It's okay. Again, you're projecting this where I swear to God there is absolutely no textual or subtextual reason to project it. But the story is set in England because Bram Stoker was pandering to an English audience. In fact, there are some notes in his notebooks that suggest he originally wanted to put the fucking thing in Romania where it belonged, but he realized that this probably wouldn't sell to an English audience, so he brought it to England to essentially modernize it. He did the Victorian equivalent of a modernized blockbuster setting things in America. I'm at an absolute loss. I don't fucking know where he pulled anti-Semitism from. It, I just, again,
And this is the moment that Dalton not broke, but is a loss for words because of how stupid and trivial Renegade Cuts video is.
Okay, but I'm usually good at seeing like the inner workings of the reasons why people do these kind of things. But okay, if you really want to be, if you really want to play this classist game, this this imp, not empiricist, but imperialist classist game of yours, I would point out that Dracula is an aristocrat. He is a Count Dracula, the thing he borrows most primarily from Elizabeth Bathory, because of course the historical Vlad Tepes Dracula was actually, I believe, considered a prince in his native country. The Count part of Count Dracula, he likely borrows mostly from the Countess Elizabeth Bathory. But if you want to play this game, then do I need to point out that I guess I do need to point out because otherwise we're left with the vacant stupidity that he just said there. Dracula is an aristocrat, and most of the people he feeds upon are vulnerable people, like women, in the case of Mina and in the case of Mina and Lucy, and people in the lower classes, like Renfield and the shipmates that he basically butchers on the high seas for no other reason than basically sport. So if anything, this could be seen as a encroachment of an aristocrat using the connections of his aristocracy to do what aristocrats did all the fucking time in the Victorian era, which is essentially holiday in another country. And there's no real intention of Dracula to emigrate anywhere because much in the same way as most aristocracy in the old Victorian days, he didn't need to emigrate anywhere because he could just freely choose to move around Europe if he wanted to, as long as he had the resources to do so. And that was actually what he wanted to do. If you actually listen to his justification, both in the movie and the novel, he wanted to essentially use England as a stronghold to then basically bring vampirism back to the Western world through England to the rest of Europe. Because he was upset that all the dark things in the supernatural had essentially been banished to the far reaches of Eastern Europe and Romania, where essentially in the Victorian mind were the sort of the untempered wilderness or the unexplored wilderness where like dark mystical things could still be hidden. jack-o'-lanterns.
Van Helsing notes that Dracula can only survive by importing the dirt of his homeland. In other words, this story for a Victorian audience is saying that this evil foreigner does not belong here.
Transylvania is not England.
Oh, for fuck's
Maybe
sake.
I'm not sure.
You missed the most important aspect of Dracula's Earth. In the original story of Dracula, which is something that Bram Stoker borrowed from East European folklore, vampires were at their strongest when they slept in sanctified ground. So if Dracula was really as pro-Christian as you want it to be framed as, according to this video, you might want to point out the fact that it is in fact the sanctification rites that were often employed in graveyards and the like that led to Dracula being able to feed on the power of that earth. But you can't point that out because that might give lie to your traditionalism and Christianity bad narrative. God damn it, Leon. He chose the dirt of his native land because the dirt of his native land was taken from sanctified graveyards, and he knew full well that the vast majority of churches in England, by virtue of being churches of England, didn't go through the same sanctification rites that Catholic churches went through. That's why he bothered with the whole transplanting earth from his native land thing. And also, he needed the dirt of his native land because the darkness that he ruled over had essentially started to bleed into the land around his castle and corrupt it, which has absolutely bumfuck nothing to do with xenophobia or fear of immigrants or any of that. It has everything to do with he's a fucking vampire, and this is traditional vampire lore that Bram Stoker rather painstakingly did research for before he wrote the fucking thing. And if you really want to believe that Bram Stoker was this pious Christian Avenger type character, I would have to point out to you that Bram Stoker was a bohemian aristocrat who regularly was involved in social clubs like the Hellfire Club in England and the Rosicrucians and things of that, which were humanist secular organizations primarily, and secondarily mystical hermetic occult orders. In fact, for a short while, Bram Stoker was a member of the fucking Golden Dawn, which famously gave rise to people like Aleister fucking Crowley and Samuel McGregor Mathers. This is important because these two men were probably the least Christian motherfuckers you could find in England at the time. And they were using ancient Egyptian and Greco-Roman fucking mystical rites on the regular. And even Jewish ones. So if Bram Stoker was such a pious avenger, you might explain why he supped with so many bohemian poets who were overtly atheist, and why he was an active member of organizations like the Rosicrucians and the Golden Dawn. But you just wanted to dump on Victorian values and traditionalism and Christianity, so you picked Dracula to use as the platform for it, completely irregardless of where the lore of Dracula actually comes from, or the people that actually made the damn thing. But do go on. Jack-o'-lanterns.
Dracula was a novel that reflected the fears of late Victorian society. the sexuality of women, homosexuality, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, but it was also about the hope for something greater, that these fears could be conquered. If Dracula is the personification of these fears, then his defeat in the end is the manifestation of that hope. This film adaptation silences
All of your conjecture as to why he is the manifestation of these fears is completely fucking foobar. So this entire narrative is completely fucking foobar. There's nothing about Victorian anxieties that reaches into Dracula any more than anti-Trump hysteria reaches into modern horror movies, just very much despite the attempts to make it so. Dracula was essentially Bram Stoker trying to interest people in older stories like the ones from Eastern Europe and Romania in a modern context. He essentially took the old legends of what is now Romania and put them in the Victorian equivalent of a blockbuster because he hoped it would make people more interested in the supernatural and in East European culture because he found Eastern European culture to be fascinating. And he found the idea of the vampire to be fascinating. And again, he wasn't some pious Christian avenger or a super dedicated humanist. He was a bohemian artist who was interested mostly in the creation of poetry and art, and secondarily, very heavily interested in the occult, which again, if Victorian if Victorian culture was so anxious and stuffy and traditionalistic back then, you're gonna have to go ahead and explain to me why the fuck the occult revival happened in the first place. God damn you. But jack-o'-lanterns, let's get this. Let's begin the
some
end
of
of
these
this.
fears. Hope. This film adaptation silences some of these fears. Mina, for example, has a larger role. There are times when she even has agency, and the final moments are all hers. It is by her will that Dracula regains a piece of his soul. In this version, Christianity is not divided, and it is safe to question one's faith. The antagonist cannot be mistaken for a homosexual demon, and so forth. In this way, the film tells
I can't honestly, but okay. Again, as I said, the novel is told from the perspective of fictional letters being written between Mina, Lucy, Jonathan, Van Helsing, and the like. I can't believe you would just straight up erase the agency that Mina must have had by default to even write such letters to make the claim that the Francis Ford Coppola version focused more heavily on her agency. Given that the entire plot is focused on Mina and Lucy being victims of Dracula, I don't know how you can see them anything as other than probably the most important characters in the entire fucking thing. It was because Mina resembled his late wife that Dracula even got involved in the first place. How the fuck did you manage to marginalize Mina Harker in the story of fucking Dracula? I don't even. Oh god. And again, the more traditionalism bad, more Victorianism bad, and more Christianity bad narrative you're spinning is completely fucking foobar, as I have outlined many times throughout this entire fucking thing. Jack o'
us that Dracula, or what he represented, can be defeated. Hi everyone, if you like what I do,
Leon, I very much used to like what you do, believe it or not, but you're beginning to slowly and surely frustrate me. That being said, you are free to say these things just as I am free to attempt to offer the countervailing opinion as and when you say stupid shit. And you are free to say that I say stupid shit as and when you have an argument against the things that I say. Or any time in general. Anyone is free to say the things that I say are stupid. I do hope that they provide me with an argument as to when my things are stupid, but I support a discourse in which everyone can call everyone else stupid as and when they think they're being stupid. Because freedom of speech is great. And ideological woo is very much not, in my humble opinion anyway.
Amen. Hallelujah.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, I had nothing really to add to that. Just because I have not seen the film, but I knew automatically that he was kind of wrong just on the fact that he started to infer these certain things of kind of the politics or whatever.
You really should give it a try because Bram Stoker's Dracula is awesome.
Well, I know, and I wanted to check it out. Just I haven't, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'm sure with it being Halloween soon, some network will be playing it. I don't know what TV provider you have, but I'd be willing to look it up to see what channel will be playing it if you want me to. In fact, let me do that for you so you have the opportunity to maybe see it.
Perhaps at a later date.
Maybe, but yeah. I'm sure with Halloween right around the corner, they'll probably be playing it anytime now. So.
But with that, folks, from everyone at Podcast The Storm, I would like to say goodbye, adios, aloha, auf Wiedersehen, sayonara, peace, cheers, and
Shalom. Now fuck right off.